Good evening. On behalf of the entire Jewish Community Foundation of Greater MetroWest, New Jersey, I am pleased to welcome everyone to our annual investors meeting. Simply put, the JCF is in the business of trust. Trust by our donors that we will manage their philanthropic assets responsibly and competently so that they can maximize their grants over time. We take this responsibility sincerely and believe that it is reflected in the excellent investment returns we have generated over time. As you will hear later in this evening at this meeting, we are blessed with a very accomplished group of investment committee members, and for that we are so thankful. Another reason for us to be thankful and proud is that in the last 6 months, we have become the largest community foundation in New Jersey, with almost $800 million under advisement. The objective of today's investors meeting is highlighting one particular investment theme, but we also hope to present you, our donors and financial partners, with more evidence that our investment committee is up to the task of managing your philanthropic assets adeptly, effectively, and responsibly. Thank you for your trust. And now I would like to turn the meeting over to Peter Langerman, our investment committee chair, who will be hosting the remainder of this meeting with our very exciting panel of speakers. Peter.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for that great introduction. It's great to be here this evening. I want to thank everyone for participating tonight. We'd hope to have part of this in person, but we're still on the Zoom side of things. But I think you'll find this evening interesting. Just to give you a little bit of a preview as to what to expect. We've got a very distinguished group of panelists here. We're going to lead off in a couple of minutes with Barry Ostrowsky. Barry could not be here this evening live, but we had a chance to talk to him a couple of days ago. So you'll hear from Barry, who is the CEO of RWJ Barnabas. And then with us this evening, and we'll have a nice conversation, 3 distinguished guests, Brian Gragnolati, who's the president and CEO of Atlantic Health, Nadav Kidron, one of our own, the CEO and director of Oramed Pharmaceuticals, and Fayyaz Mujtaba, who's with Wellington, managing director and global industry analyst. So I think you'll have an interesting experience listening to these folks. When that group is finished, you'll hear from our subcommittee chairs on the investment committee. I'll give a brief synopsis of some of our more interesting investment performance highlights, and then we'll wrap it up. So I think it's going to be an interesting evening. So again, first off, and let me introduce Barry in absentia, but we'll hear from Barry. Barry Ostrowsky is the CEO of Barnabas Health, New Jersey's largest integrated healthcare delivery system that annually provides treatment and services for more than 2 million patient visits. He leads the system's initiatives in responding to the new dynamics of health reform, and he's spearheading a system-wide endeavor to promote healthier living for employees and the members of our communities. Prior to joining Barnabas, he was senior partner in the law firm of Brack Eichler, and throughout his career, he's been actively involved in many organizations, including a member of the board of the New Jersey Chamber of Commerce, and was recently named a trustee of the board of Public Media, which is the operator of NJTV, New Jersey's public television network. You may have also read, and we reference it in the video, that Barry has announced his retirement. His successor has been named, so he's got a very interesting perspective, having managed and now seeing his successor take over shortly as the CEO of Barnabas. So we will cue the interview. Thank you. Welcome, and welcome to you, Barry. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us and talk to our audience. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get right to it. Healthcare, it's always in the news. Every day there's a development, positive, negative. But let's start with a sort of a general question. It's very expensive for all of us to be part of the healthcare system, and certainly to be patients and to be cared for in hospitals, even if insurance is covering most of the cost. What are the keys that you see to providing adequate care without eating up such a large share of GDP for healthcare in the United States today?
Well, first of all, Peter, thank you for the opportunity. I'm really delighted to participate this evening. I would say there are a couple of elements in the question that you've asked that probably need some explanation and elaboration beyond that, which we may have time to do this evening. First off, it is true that the $3 trillion industry known as healthcare has perhaps a disproportionate share of GDP in the 19% or almost 20% range. I think in the United States, that is partially created by the fact that we do not have sufficient monies invested in social programs because most people in their communities are unhealthy as a result of social determinants such as substandard housing, food insecurity, chronic unemployment, unsafe streets. Those things tend to be addressed in other countries, industrialized countries, and that reduces the acuity of the healthcare problems that many people face. And as a result, fewer people end up going into the formal healthcare delivery system in other countries. With respect to the hospital cost, it is also true that hospitals are the most expensive stop on the continuum of healthcare delivery. And that is because hospitals have to be capital intensive in order to deliver the care at the level of quality that we'd all want. They're highly populated by various levels of specialists in all disciplines. And of course, they serve as the venues in which we train future clinicians for healthcare delivery. So it's an expensive operation. I think the response to its expensive nature is that many more services are being conducted in outpatient venues, which is appropriate. It's both safe, more effective, and efficient, and it satisfies patients a great deal more. And so what I think you're going to see over time are fewer services done in the most expensive venue in healthcare, which are hospitals. Now, of course, the most complicated and intensive services are still going to be in hospitals. There may be fewer of them, but it's still going to be expensive. But I think their disproportionate impact on the overall cost of healthcare is going to come down as we continue to migrate to outpatient, in-home, and even virtual care, which again can be done safely and effectively for patients with many conditions and illnesses.
Thanks. So tell me, from your perspective as the head of a quote not-for-profit, what's the difference between a not-for-profit hospital and a for-profit, and should we as a country be going toward one model versus the other?
I don't think one model versus the other is necessarily a choice that has to be made. Now, I may be an outlier in the not-for-profit community because I'm not willing to bash the for-profit community. I think the major difference, of course, is that in the for-profit world, those who run operations have to consider the value created for shareholders. The shareholders in the not-for-profit world are the members of our community and other constituencies that don't actually own equity. I think the major difference is the nature of the menu of services that for-profit institutions may maintain, because frequently many of us have to provide services that don't earn money, don't earn margin, and are cross-subsidized by other services. So if you're running a for-profit operation and you can stop providing services that require subsidy, you're going to choose to do that. Now, candidly, that can only be done in communities where there are not-for-profit hospitals that are willing to provide those services that need subsidy or, in fact, lose money. So I think it's really about which services a for-profit chooses to provide in order to maintain licensure and conduct business versus many services that not-for-profits provide because they are the provider of last resort or the safety net because no one else is providing those services.
So that might pertain to the next question I'm going to ask you, which is, given that we've hopefully come out of a pandemic of the last several years, how has your hospital changed its business over the last couple of years, and do you see that continuing, those kinds of changes?
Well, I think it's clearly had an impact on all of us. And I don't think we can overstate the importance of the bedside heroes and the people who work in institutions that have had to labor self-sacrificially throughout the pandemic. I think the lessons we've learned that will continue is that there are, in fact, more efficient ways to provide care. We needed folks to do things that they previously hadn't been doing, learned how to do them, and were able to actually be more productive as a result of having people provide care at the top of their licensure capacity. I think we learned how flexible we could be on space allocation, and that was an opportunity for us, unfortunately brought upon us by the pandemic, where we had to, out of almost thin air, create intensive care units and other similar venues within the hospital in order to effectively treat patients. I also think that we've learned in the strongest sense the true value of human capital at every level. I think from medical student, nursing student, all the way through master surgeon and physician, we now have a much better appreciation for their talents and skills and how they can be applied. And I think there's another lesson that we haven't yet fully reconciled. You know, when the pandemic started, none of us were sure of what it was we were dealing with. And so we responded with the kind of tools that we ordinarily would use to respond to what we thought were similar conditions or pathogens or illnesses. It turns out that as it was going on, we learned better ways to treat patients. Now, frequently incorporating better technique takes years. People study it, people evaluate it. In this case, we didn't have time to incorporate better techniques. So it was a little bit like learning on the job. We did it within the corridors of safety, of course, but I think it taught us that we can be nimble, not only on the human capital side, but on the medical intelligence side. And so I think we're better off from a pure operational standpoint, having experienced what we did. We certainly didn't want to have to do that or ever want to do it again. But we are informed that we have greater capacities for productivity than we might have thought in our conventional operations prior to the stress of the pandemic.
Thank you. So let me ask one final question. We know that you've announced your retirement, at least from your current position. Your successor has been named, and I'm sure you've had many conversations. But give us a little bit of insight when you either have had or will have the sit down with your successor. You know, the kinds of things that I wish I had known, or some advice about going forward. Trying to run this very complicated enterprise.
Well, thank you. I'm excited about the decision I made, to be honest with you. Look, I think, apropos of your earlier question, I think organizations like ours have to be focused on the mission. Why are we in business? What is it that we have to attain to successfully pursue that mission? And I think any distraction from operational approach to the mission becomes a problem. In our case, we say we have a very simple mission: make the communities healthier. We do that through clinical programs, and we do it through social programs. And my advice has been and will continue to be to my successor and the new leadership team, let's keep focused on that. We can't give up one in favor of the other. We have to fund both social programs that address social determinants and clinical programs that deal in the conventional medical and surgical sense for service for conditions that our patients have when they present. In our view, a combination of those two platforms will make us successful. I'm confident and frankly enthusiastic about our new leadership team taking that up and doing a wonderful job in ensuring that we do attain our mission over the years to come.
Well, thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you for all that you've given to the community, to the Federation, and our best wishes on wherever your next career takes you. I'm sure we'll be reading with great interest what that is. So again, thanks for the time this evening. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter, for those kind words, and it was my pleasure. Be well. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, well, again, I want to thank Barry for taking the time to speak to us this evening. I hope you found those comments interesting. I know I did. So now we're going to move on to our live panelists. And just a note, if you do have a question for our panelists, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you can pose your question there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of their comments. So let me introduce our panelists. I mentioned their names, but let me give a little bit more information about their backgrounds. So Brian Gragnolati, as I said, President and CEO of the Atlantic Health System. So I'll be interested to hear whether he has any views, comments, differences of opinion, or similar thoughts as to Barry. But Brian, again, President and CEO of Atlantic Health, which we all know, former chair of the board of the American Hospital Association. Brian regularly is in the media, CNBC, MSNBC, et cetera, and a featured speaker at many events such as the Aspen Ideas Health Conference, World Hospital Congress, other things. Atlantic is a big company, $3.5 billion in revenues, 18,000 associates, team members, serving almost 5 million people, 400 sites, including Morristown Medical, Goree Children's Hospital. It's a big operation. Brian began his career as an emergency medical technician. So I guess you could say worked his way up through the operations and obviously, running a major enterprise. Nadav, thank you for being here this evening. Nadav is one of ours, CEO and director of Oramed Pharmaceuticals, which he co-founded in 2006. Oramed is, among other things, the first company to conduct phase 3 trials under the FDA for oral insulin. Nadav is an entrepreneur, we all know, with experience including senior executive roles in a wide variety of industries. He co-founded Oravax Medical as a JV with Oramed and Primus Biotech and serves as the chairman. Oravax is dedicated to bringing an oral COVID-19 vaccine to market. Also founded EnteraBio as a JV with Oramed and DNA Biomedical Solutions. A member of various boards, the IATI board, international lecturer, obviously a very active individual in this space, and has a lot of ideas, by the way. And if we have time, hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about obesity and diabetes, which is one of the real serious issues that we have to deal with in the healthcare system. And finally, we're pleased to have Fayyaz Mujtaba joining us. Fayyaz is a managing director and global industry analyst with Wellington, which is a major asset management company specializing in global medical technology, life science tools, and diagnostic industries, doing fundamental research, making buy-sell recommendations for portfolio managers at Wellington, located in their Boston office. Joined Wellington in 2011. As a member of the Launch Research Associate Program. So very experienced analyst with Wellington, which obviously is a very high class investment organization. So again, thank you gentlemen for joining us this evening. And Brian, maybe we will just start with you. If you had any comments, thoughts, reactions to Barry's comments, pretty broad range of questions, but any reactions initially to what we discussed?
Thanks, Peter. Barry and I are great colleagues and great friends, and it's always a pleasure to listen to his point of view. And we're going to miss him working here in New Jersey. He's really had a profound impact, and I know there's going to be a lot of time to congratulate and thank him for what he's done. I thought he answered those questions that you asked in a very appropriate and reasonable manner. And I'm just going to enhance a couple pieces of this. This healthcare system here in the United States is like no other. And that's good, because there shouldn't be other healthcare systems like this throughout the country. Because this is a system of sick care, not well care. It's a system that's fragmented. And that fragmentation is really what drives the cost of healthcare and the escalation of cost of healthcare in this country. So in my role as the chairman of the board of the American Hospital Association, I got to tour the country for 3 years and see the variety of venues care is provided in, to see the kinds of communities that our healthcare system changes. And because of that, you see why it's a challenge to try to get our arms around the affordability issues. But I think part of the answers here are to move away from a system that rewards the quantity of care that you provide and move toward a system that really recognizes that we've got to integrate care. We've got to, as Barry said, move care to lower cost settings. But ultimately, we need to share financial responsibility between those who pay for care, including patients, and those who provide care. So Atlantic, we've really leaned into that. Here in New Jersey, of the roughly 1.1 million people that we cared for last year, we have about 465,000 of those people in some sort of network or value-based arrangement with us, where we begin to align those interests. And consequently, we have seen the cost curve bend. And some of them are Medicare programs that are sponsored through the CMMI process and some of the stuff that was done on Obamacare. With our Horizon partners, Blue Cross partners, 25% of our commercial business is now an up and downside financial risk where our interests are truly aligned. And then even with our own employees and dependents, we've put a consortium together with 5 other healthcare systems, just with our own employees and dependents that are self-insured. And we've got almost 80,000 people in that. And we have seen our ability to really drive down the rate of increase in healthcare. So there are some answers here. They're not easy. They're going to be nuanced based on where you are. But this affordability issue is the one that plagues us, and we've got to fix that.
Thanks. So Nadav, let me turn to you. In a way, the same question, but from a different perspective. You know, you're an entrepreneur. You've started some interesting businesses. From your perspective, when you're thinking about what an interesting business to get in would be and profitable, you're not a not-for-profit. Like, how are you thinking about some of the issues that we just heard about? You know, from Brian, from Barry, in terms of where are the interesting entry points for someone who's coming up with a new technology or something different to basically improve the way the system is working today?
I think Brian and Barry are coming from one leg of the table and I'm on the other leg. On the one hand, if they will be able to deal with that bureaucracy and fragmentation and to allow the system to be more efficient, that will get us halfway there. The other half is where I am, where we need to drive innovation, because eventually better lives for everyone, reduced cost, us living on Earth, which is going to be a pleasant place, it depends on innovation. So what I try to do, and I can tell you also, like you mentioned, I'm sitting on the board of the umbrella organization of high tech and biotech in Israel, is really to make sure that we can bring the innovation that will enable us to change the world. And then hopefully this complex system will be able to swallow it so we can really reach a better world.
Thanks. And Fayyaz, let me bring it to you. You know, your job is to figure out where investors can make money, where your portfolio managers ought to be allocating their capital. How are you thinking about the opportunity set, given the cost issues that we've heard about from Brian and Barry, the entrepreneurial side from a Nadav standpoint? Like, how do you go about your job if you're like, where are these opportunities that can not only be profitable, presumably be a benefit to the overall system?
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. And I think if you look at the order of how we just discussed, I'm really on the other end, maybe one removed from Nadav on helping allocate capital to the most innovative and profitable companies. I would say probably there are a lot of real issues that Brian and Barry mentioned around the cost side, right? And while there might be reasonable reasons for that, one of the things we're trying to tie in is what Nadav said: look at the most innovative companies where there's true innovation, where you improve outcomes for patients, providers, and society broadly, but also do it at a fair price and a fair economic return, right? And one of the things we've focused on probably the last 10 years, a lot more out of our healthcare investing practice. I'm part of a team. I follow medical technology. I have team members that follow biotech, biopharma, as well as healthcare services. And one of the areas are, especially if we move towards a more value-based care environment, are we pricing appropriately for the incremental innovation we're bringing? And I'll say personally, I focus a lot more on real meaningful innovation, where if you truly can improve downstream outcomes, that you will be rewarded, and maybe avoiding some of the more commoditizing or incremental innovation companies that maybe price without necessarily a real value. So we are trying our best to allocate capital towards the more differentiated areas.
Thanks. And Brian, maybe as a follow-up to that, you addressed this a bit, but how, if at all, has the pandemic and the issues raised by the pandemic changed the way you do business?
You know, I think both of our other panelists have talked about innovation, and that really is the secret sauce here. And it's got to be, as you just mentioned, it's got to be meaningful and purposeful, because there's a lot out there. You know, we as a company invest in other companies, and we have a whole structure in place, and I actually do advising the companies. So, you know, I see it from the investor side also, and there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise out there that you have to cut through, and a lot of companies that actually don't make money. But that seems to be a theme. You know, but the pandemic, I think, really forced us to innovate, and Barry described, you know, some of the clinical capacity issues, but we're a hard industry to change. You know, we're all trained to be perfect in healthcare, and that quest for perfection creates enormous delays and almost an inability to want to change things that are working. Now, that being said, we've obviously transformed healthcare in so many ways. You know, being able to replace a valve through the groin. I mean, that's clearly innovation. But the cycle time to do stuff like that is incredible. So the biggest learning I had out of the pandemic, when we had no choice, was to push decision-making down to the bedside, create the enabling conditions and the focus. And in our instance, it was on two things: never close our doors to our community and protect our teammates at all costs. Those two principles guided us and allowed an incredible amount of innovation to occur. Because if you remember back at the beginning of the pandemic, we were at the epicenter, and we were seeing a doubling of cases in our hospitals every 2 to 3 days, a doubling every 2 to 3 days. And, you know, we were on the verge of running out of ventilators, and we had to figure out different ways to use that. And I remember when the government gave us the ventilators from their stockpiles, the circuits, the tubing were rotted. And our biomedical engineers had to use and develop coupling mechanisms on our 3D printers to do that. Now, we didn't take it through a committee. It didn't take 5 years to get approval to use those. We didn't beg the government to do that. We just did it because the choice was people were going to die. And so I think we learned a lesson about speed. I think we learned a lesson about taking more calculated risks. And now what we've got to do is work with the governments and our regulators to allow us that flexibility. And I think if we get that flexibility, you're going to see unleashed a lot more innovation, and we're going to keep those lessons. But if we revert back to all the old rules, we're going to be back in the same box.
So Nadav, that's that really leads right to you, which is the question is, one, have you seen changes? I mean, I guess the good thing is vaccine approvals came very quickly, probably in an unprecedented timetable. On the other hand, you know, we saw an Alzheimer's drug get approved, and there were a lot of questions as to whether the proper, you know, checks and balances were in place. So what is your take in terms of, you know, has the speed of approvals changed? Is there more government openness, willingness to look at new technologies, and how do you take that into account in your daily work?
I think the speed is relevant from two sides of the equation. If you think about it, the average time to develop a drug is 17 years. So I always joke with my peers in the high-tech world that by the time I finished the back and forth with the FDA, my friend in high-tech started a company, sold it, and I'm still waiting for the FDA response. But what happened is, as a company, you know, we were sitting, for example, in my example, we're sitting with a technology that allows us to take injections and deliver them orally. And then COVID comes into the world. So suddenly, instead of taking your time and working slowly on your programs, you have to say, okay, you know what, maybe I can come up with an oral vaccine. Let's work on it, but you have to work much faster. So that changed from the innovation side, but it also changed from the government side. And the big change was that up until COVID, the FDA was the authority. We also have the European, but the FDA was the authority as far as approving drugs. Many countries would wait on the FDA and only then would approve drugs. What happened with the COVID vaccine is that many countries started and gave their own approval to approve drugs, which it's unprecedented. But along with that, there's also a price we pay. And I don't want to be over dramatic, but you have to understand that COVID basically split the world. There are people who trust the vaccines, and there are people, and it's not a small number, who do not trust that vaccine. So you're going to trust this doctor and you're not going to trust that doctor. It never used to be that way. We had one authority and everybody would adhere and would trust them. I heard people in Congress talking, they don't trust the FDA. So that means that both the authorities and the innovation companies will have to make sure that they can convey and can convince everybody in some things that we would have taken them for granted prior to COVID.
And so Fayyaz, again, sitting there trying to ferret through entrepreneurial companies, some of the legacy companies, how quickly drugs can get approved. How do you work through all those issues, and has it changed your perspective and perhaps some of your recommendations one way or the other, given these changes?
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly has, and there are a few themes we're looking at, and I'm looking at coming out of this. I'd say one is it's a bit of a dual hat role. I think, as you know, with Wellington, we manage just over $1 trillion AUM across equities and fixed income. And then we also divide some of the capital to let industry specialists manage assets. So I manage about $2 billion in purely medical technology assets, but then support portfolio managers here that invest broadly in healthcare. So one of the things coming out really were, I think Brian briefly mentioned on the innovation side, this sort of company that might deliver a valve through the growing. I mean, so there's so many examples of this really meaningful innovation. One of the areas we've invested in early was a company like Edwards Life Sciences that develops these transcatheter aortic valve replacement treatments. And one of the themes coming out, Peter, was these procedure-oriented medical device companies really suffered during the pandemic from the shock to the system, and elective or even surgeries that shouldn't be considered elective were delayed to some degree. And so one of those we've been looking at, are there certain business models that were overly penalized that might be at their trough cash flows in near term, and also at their trough multiples versus the market, that actually could be interesting multi-year investments. So that's one bucket, the COVID losers, if you will. The other bucket I've been looking at are the so-called the businesses that are emerging stronger out of the pandemic when they entered. And here, there's some innovative companies in diagnostics and life science tools in particular, where COVID basically was an excuse to refresh and innovate or invest in the higher innovation segments within diagnostics. And so there we're looking at where are there long-term tailwinds, let's say recurring revenues from consumables being used from new tests right after COVID, and then where could the demand be short-lived? I think Brian mentioned the ventilator example. There's some elements where it was a demand shock maybe, but we might not need to be purchasing the same level of equipment every year. And so these are the types of things where are we getting stronger, where might be the benefits short-lived, and as some also mentioned, there's some signs of excess in the market, certainly on the growth side. Inflation and rates are changing very much today versus even 3 months ago. So some of the most innovative companies are selling off along with the speculative assets. So we're trying to be careful there and pick our spots.
Great, thanks. Brian, one of the oft talked about and somewhat controversial topics, certainly with respect to hospitals, is hospital consolidation. And I'll ask Nadav and Fayyaz more broadly to talk about that. But I mean, I know I've been reading, there are a few hospitals. I think you may be involved in trying to buy one or more hospitals in the state. And there's always controversy. Is that going to be cost effective? Is it going to be more monopolistic? Is it a benefit to the system? And then we have the broader issues about supply chain. And if we have fewer suppliers, does that mean that we'll continue to have these supply chain issues? So either or both with respect to hospital consolidation and maybe even your vendors, sort sort of generally, what is your take on consolidation, and is it sort of pro-consumer, or is it something that that the consumer ought to be very nervous about and concerned about?
I think at the end of the day, it's about what is the reason for doing it, and we've actually stayed out of the kind of the fire-fueled consolidation efforts in this state. We say no to more than we say yes to. And that's because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is create a clinically integrated network as opposed to collect a bunch of hospitals. So we're much more deliberate about that. And our strategy has to be, can we improve access to care? Can we drive more affordability by taking on financial risk? And then what does the delivery system need to look like in order to do that? So that's what generates our growth. We create innovative partnerships with physicians and other facilities to do that. There are reasons that consolidation needs to occur, particularly in the rural parts of our country, because access to care is an enormous problem. And without the kind of support that can be provided, these places would be deserts, healthcare deserts. So, contrary to my roots here, I'm not a huge fan of blind consolidation for the sake of getting bigger. And I think it has to be purposeful.
And what about on the vendor side? There's always some amount of M&A going on, but is that an issue for you in that, two of your suppliers of, XYZ all of a sudden decide to get together and now, less price competition, et cetera, or do you see cost benefits from those kinds of activities?
The bigger problem I have is not the vendors. The bigger problem I have is the insurers. You look at United and what United's trying to do right now, the government ought to have its eyes wide open on that. If you think about the profitable sectors in healthcare right now, look at that sector, look at their earnings. On the supplier side, I think that we've gotten our act together as group purchasing organizations and other things to be able to effectively deal with that. I think that where we get challenged is on the technology side, particularly when there's a single provider of that. But oftentimes we can create partnerships with them. So we've been having more success than we have with a company like United, which is impossible to deal with.
And Nadav,
hopefully I just probably upset somebody that's invested in it.
Well, that's good. If we haven't upset somebody tonight, we haven't done our jobs. So thank you. But so Nadav, from your perspective, many times the exit for entrepreneurial companies is selling to large pharma or some of the other larger companies. Obviously, you have a bit of an advantage, I suppose, being nimble. But what is your perspective generally on the state of M&A and consolidation in the healthcare business generally?
I think it's no surprise for anybody that the market, especially the biotechnology market, is very much depressed right now. And I think what it means that many IPOs that were done, maybe they were not fully justified. And now we got to the point that data will talk. And I think what will make the difference now between the winners and losers is the companies that will come with real data that is innovative, that can really have an impact on the whole system. Those will be the winners. So even though markets go up and down, and now we're at the down point, innovation is needed. Innovation is here to stay, and we must find the ways to make sure that it will continue. And I believe that the market will hopefully be efficient enough to recognize those innovations, and we're going to see maybe less M&A, but maybe smarter M&A.
Okay, and Fayyaz, it's always nice to own a company that gets taken out at a 30 or 40% premium. But how much of the potential for takeout, or on the flip side, the potential for a company to dilute itself by overpaying for something else, comes into your thought process and looking at various positions?
No, it's really important, right? And I think just as we're seeing consolidation on the hospital side and different parts of the market, you're certainly seeing consolidation on the medical technology side as well as biopharma. In a way, the large cap companies truly can't have a monopoly on innovation forever, right? All these small cap acquisitions help elongate the duration of their pipeline, right? And their work. So it's quite essential. I would say one thing that Nadav mentioned is interesting just on the speculative assets part has been, it's almost felt like a reverse yield curve watching the biotech market, and some of the most preclinical and early stage companies for a period were attracting some very phenomenal valuations. And the closest you were to reality and maybe having drugs in clinic, for some reason, the valuation was a bit more moderate. So I think some of the excesses are coming out, and there are truly some gems in the market right now that make a ton of sense from a consolidation standpoint. The other, I would just say on the larger cap companies, just we look at, are they the rightful owner of the business? Do they enhance their value proposition to customers by owning this? Or is this purely financial engineering? And there have been some where when it's done more for financial reasons, for earnings accretion, we might tend to stray away if it looks like a company is doing it to make a quick buck.
So while we have Brian here and Fayyaz, I'm not sure if you cover the public hospital companies, but do you have a view as to the relative attractiveness and how do you contrast today's valuations, today's attractiveness of hospitals generally with what they were pre-pandemic and more generally versus some of the other spaces in the healthcare universe?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And I would say with the caveat that I have a colleague that who, just like I focus on medical technology, he focuses on healthcare services, including hospitals. That said, I follow quite closely. I would say it varies. For us on the equity side, we primarily look at the for-profit hospitals like the HCAs of the world. And then we do have a large fixed income practice that funds the debt side of a lot of non-for-profit hospitals. And so I would just caveat that the investable units for equities are a lot narrower. That said, it does feel like hospital valuations, it's interesting. Hospital earnings power did rise over the last 3 years since before the pandemic. If you look at the relative valuations versus the market, have not expanded as much. And more of these, because of the leverage, are still on relatively modest EBITDA multiples. And so that's one thing. While certainly they performed well, it doesn't look too rich, especially given the pullback. The other area, Peter, you're just saying maybe around the supplier side. One area that has suffered and derated a bit more are hospital supply companies, the companies like Baxter, Becton Dickinson, providing the more routine consumables sold into the hospitals. Those are probably at bigger trough multiples. And there's some concerns right now around their ability to pass on pricing to hospital customers due to the inflation and supply shocks. And as Brian mentioned, and Barry might have on the GPO side, have really bargained hard with these supply companies. So some things are pressuring them, but that might be where they're bigger discounts today, relatively speaking.
So let me ask really for all of you, but we'll start with Brian. These supply issues, which we hear about affecting almost everyone, from cars to hospitals to building materials, whatever they are. How serious are they for you today? And do you see this as a more permanent problem or transitory? A dangerous word to use these days, but more of a transitory issue that will get over and be sort of back to normal in another, call it, year.
They're very serious. The one that's happening over the last several weeks is contrast that's used in a lot of imaging, and that's a huge problem because we're on the cusp of having to make some clinical allocation decisions right now around that. And through the pandemic, we went through various phases of that. We had a period of time where paralytics and sedatives were very, very impaired to a point where we had to get some trade tariffs changed, and we had to get some opioid legislation changed in order to do that. Unfortunately, the administration at that time was willing to do those turns pretty quickly under emergency use authorizations. So it varies. I think that this notion of just-in-time delivery, I think we learned doesn't work in a pandemic. So we're back to warehousing, and I can sleep better at night because of that. So we're holding on for the next couple of years, trying to see how this all shakes out on the supply chain side. But we're pretty concerned about it.
Nadav, is it impacting your businesses at all?
Yeah, the COVID, the supply chain, think about it. We're running now 2 phase 3 on diabetics, type 2, are usually older people. So, we had centers that had to close down because there was COVID in the area, and then to get the drugs from one place to another. So there's almost nobody who's untouched and is not being affected by it. And the biggest question is, how long is this going to last? And I think that the answer is we're not really sure. And I think for corporations such as ourselves, we have to do our best to try and mitigate it, but it could be challenging more often than no. But overall, I can tell you that with all the issues, a lot of the clinical trials did go through, and you can mitigate it by opening more clinical sites, and there's other ways that you can do in order to try to do your best. But one thing is for sure, that nothing is for sure, and we live in times that there's a lot of uncertainty.
And Fayyaz, how are you taking this into account? Do you see it as a permanent trend, and therefore you're focusing on some companies that may be the beneficiary, or on the other side of it, companies that are on the losing end of some of these supply chain issues?
Yeah, certainly a bit of both. It does feel like it's impacting the market broadly. That said, we're looking at, the absolute impact as well as relative to the market. Just one quick one for Brian, that contrast agent, it's interesting. We were looking at this shortage last 2 weeks in particular, since some of the issues came out. And last week I was speaking with the CEO of Siemens Healthineers, which is a large CT and MRI manufacturer. And I guess the quick take there, it sounds like GE, being the large manufacturer, especially having operations in China, was severely impacted in Shanghai. The Siemens, at least from a CEO perspective, thought this hopefully is short-lived between the 3 contrast agent manufacturers, and that we might be in a situation 3 or 6 months from now that where it's improving, supposedly, from what the companies are saying. So this has become nature of the game, because a few years ago this was not as big of a role in my job. I would say 2 quick ones just to be short. We look at where is the real fundamental impact. So is it delaying demand for these companies, or is it destroying demand if they can't fulfill an order today? Most of it feels like delaying orders for a lot of the medical equipment companies, but we're watching this carefully. And then the other is the level of pricing inflation in one P&L versus others. I would say one issue we're finding is pricing power of healthcare suppliers vary dramatically. And so some of the hospital supply companies and medical device companies haven't been able to pass on pricing as quickly to hospitals and the rest. The price mechanism is not as real time, and they need to go contracting with GPOs and see, and as you know, it's tough negotiating. The part that does have pricing power is life science tools. B2B businesses that are selling research consumables and production consumables to pharma companies. Those pharma companies are in a strong spot. And so it seems like there's some pockets in healthcare that do have pricing power, which is interesting to see.
So Nadav is in a good position. Good for you. I want to turn to a question or a comment question from Julie Stone. I'm just going to read it because I think it's an interesting broad question. She says, totally agree that we have an extremely dysfunctional healthcare system. It would be interesting to hear about additional initiatives to address this beyond innovation. Innovation is critical, but there is significant social change, attitudinal changes, and structural changes that need to go along with innovation. How else can large healthcare organizations, for-profit and not-for-profit, have an impact? Again, we could probably spend 3 hours on that, but maybe, Brian, let's start with you if you have a thought on those questions.
I think Barry in his comments addressed it, that in this country, we don't necessarily fund the social systems to the extent that other countries do. And then that gets layered on to the healthcare spend. And I know in my time at Johns Hopkins, we focused a lot, particularly in the blocks around Johns Hopkins Hospital, on really looking at how do we support the community through community service workers, people that go into people's homes, just check on them and make sure that they have what they need, because there's such disparity of care. And we see that in zip code after zip code here in the United States. So unfortunately, as Nadav talked about, we're at a point in this country, and I would argue in other parts of the world, where there's such a great divide that we can't come to an agreement on anything in government right now. And I think that level of dysfunction is going to paralyze us. So my comment is vote, make your voices known, get involved with this, because what's going on in the government right now is insane. And we're not going to have a prayer to get innovation and get drugs out quickly. We're not going to have a prayer to make sure that we've got a climate that entrepreneurs can come forward with ideas that are truly going to change healthcare. And we don't have an environment where we're not run amok with regulations that are keeping us from doing the right thing. And until we can fix that problem, we're not going to do that. And the only way we can fix it is to vote and to engage.
Nadav, any thoughts?
Oh, usually it's interesting when the one panelist disagree with the other. These times I find it easier to agree than disagree. But I think as we nearing the end, I want to talk more on the positive side. We spoke a lot about the challenges. We spoke about the fragmented medical care system that is here in the United States. We spoke about the supply chain. We spoke about COVID. But I really want to emphasize the good things. And the good things is that I just flew here now to New York without a mask, and people are vaccinated and feel better to walk around. Traveling is back to normal. So with all the challenges that we have, the human power seems to be able to get us on a good route again. And that's why, even though the markets are down and maybe go up at one point or another, I think a tremendous amount of credit is due to a lot. And again, I'm talking from the innovation side, from what I see, that a lot of strong spirit that's been there in order to make sure that these challenges are going to be something of the past. So we're going to have to face the present ones, but I'm sure we're going to overcome them as well.
Thanks. And Fayyaz, maybe a perspective that I'm sure you're very familiar with, ESG, this environmental social governance. I think the question almost incorporates that notion too. So I'm curious how you incorporate that, those concepts and the focus on those concepts when you're looking at healthcare companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's becoming an increasingly important question and something very much has become integrated on our side. And I just want to echo one thing Nadav said just on the innovation front. We've certainly gone through a biopharma innovation boom as well as a medical device innovation boom last 10 years. And I was trying to just pull up the data, but if you look at the amount of monoclonal antibodies in development or produced today, the amount of cell and gene therapies that are in trials today, it's night and day today versus 10 years ago. And so there is so much real innovation coming that when you put that up against evaluation, I do think it's quite an attractive sector. On ESG, the way we've integrated it is really consider separate from the equity rating, what should be the rating of a company on environmental, social, and governance perspectives. And we do a lot of engagement directly with the companies. And so we're engaging frequently with board directors and doing separate calls on these matters, independent of profits and the long-term fundamentals of the company. So apologies if you can hear my puppy in the background, but basically it's become a larger part of our process and truly something we try to hold the CEOs of these companies accountable for.
Well, great. Well, our time has gone very quickly. So we're going to bring this section of the program to an end. Thank you. Thank you all very much. I think it was really interesting, and we got a lot of good insights. And Brian, hopefully you got some news on your contrast that it was worth your while. So hopefully you got something out of this as well. But again, I want to thank Brian Gragnolati, Nadav Kidron, Fayyaz, Mujtaba. Really appreciate your participation, and thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're gonna move on. I hope that you in the audience found that interesting. I know that I did. So we appreciate all of their participation. So I'm going to do a couple things. One is I will tee up the reports from our subcommittee chairs. Those of you who've participated in this program in the past have heard from Jeff Braemer on the equity side, Michael Weinstock on the flexible capital and fixed income side, David Pulver on our private equity side. So you'll hear from them. Those are pre-recorded, so you'll hear their comments. And just a couple of words, not unimportant, but investment performance. And I'm sure that I hope all of you, but certainly most of you, pay attention to our numbers. We sent out the numbers as of December 31st of last year. And if you are a recipient of our quarterly communication, you see the numbers through March. A little bit of a tale of different cities. You know, if you looked at the numbers as of the end of last year, obviously we had had a very positive run. Our managed pool, I think we can be proud of the performance of our managed pool. It certainly has, it's generated very significant positive returns over 1, 3, 5 plus 10-year period. It has largely beaten its internal benchmarks. Basically done what we've wanted to do, which is to participate in capital appreciation, but given private equity, given flexible capital, to protect a little bit on the downside and not to have as much volatility as just an overall equity instrument would. Our equity portfolio, as again, not surprisingly, had more volatility. It will. In great markets, it's going to do better in large part from an absolute standpoint than a managed pool. But fast forward to today, you know, this year, this calendar year, the first quarter, certainly April and the beginning of May, put today aside because it was a positive day, has been a pretty rough go. But even with that, I think that, you know, our managed pool is hanging in there. You know, through March, our managed pool was down just a little over 2%. April, it was down a little more than 4%, certainly better than the S&P, which, you know, was down through those two periods, 13 and change. May has been another tough sledding month so far. You know, we'll see. Obviously, we've got headwinds, we've got inflation, we've got Ukraine, we've got supply issues, supply constraint issues that we were just talking about. But I think that again, most of the money is in the managed pool. I think it's performing as we would hope and expect. We did send to you, and I hope you got a chance to look at the components of our managed pool. Private equity has not surprisingly held in extremely well. We're very happy, and again, you'll hear from David talking a little bit about private equity, but to be in the top names in private equity has been very helpful. Flexible capital, again, some of that is hedge funds, some of that is fund of funds. It's been very helpful in this kind of a volatile environment to provide that steady anchor to a very volatile environment. So, you know, it's hard to predict where the markets will go. You know, sort of feels like there's been a bit of a washing out, but lots of uncertainty on the horizon. But that's why we have a diversified portfolio. That's why we have different allocations to different asset classes. And you have an investment committee that has been working very hard. We just had a meeting last week with our consultant, Prime Buchholz, you know, thinking about, are we properly positioned? Do we have the right managers? Making changes when appropriate. So you have a very active investment committee working for you. So with that, why don't we tee up our reports from our subcommittee folks? And I said it's going to be Jeff and Michael and David talking about their respective areas. So let's tee that up. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Jeff Braemer, the chair of the Equity Subcommittee, where I volunteer along with a number of other experienced, longtime investors on behalf of your charitable assets. For many of you, that was the sixth time you've heard me say that, with this being the sixth annual investors meeting. Ordinarily, I would talk about our committee's philosophy for the equity allocations with a few comments about recent performance. However, when I looked at how dramatic the equity markets have been since the last time we spoke, and how different equity returns have been over the last year and a half, it seemed like your main questions would be, you know, what happened? What does it mean for your equity investments? And what does that mean going forward? So jumping back a year, when I looked at my personal donor advised fund's first quarter 2021 statement, the equity pool had a then trailing 1-year return of 58% versus 52% for its benchmark. So there was a significant rebound from the early 2020 sell-off when the COVID pandemic first bit into the equity markets. And I don't know about anyone else, but through mid-2021, some of us thought the equity markets might stabilize into more of a normal environment, or at least a more typical one. That wasn't the case. And when I read my most recent statement, the equity pool had a trailing 1-year return of 2.3% versus 6.5% for the benchmark. And that gap also pulled down the relative performance for longer look-back periods. So to the first two questions of what happened and what that mean for the equities in the pool, I have a few visual aids that show some of the rapid shifts in the investment environment recently. This chart from the Federal Reserve's Economic Database, or FRED as it's called, shows the annual rate of change for inflation over the last 30 years. I added a line for the long-term post-World War II average CPI of 3.5%. You can see from this that for a 10-year period, we enjoyed unusually low levels of inflation recently until it began climbing rapidly in early 2021, reaching levels that have not been seen since the late 70s or early 80s. Now, there's some debate as to whether inflation is good or bad for equities, or another way of asking, are equities a good hedge against inflation? I think the answer depends on the economic sector. Clearly, inflation has been good for energy companies as the rising prices of gas and oil are immediately passed along. And we'll come back to that point in a few minutes. But often inflation harms consumer-facing companies because they cannot raise prices quickly enough to offset their higher materials or labor costs. Plus, spending by consumers often shrinks in those times. It tends not to affect technology companies because they usually have productivity gains to offset higher costs, and their customers rely more on technology at those times to keep their own costs down. So all other things being equal, once companies adjust to a new level of inflation, be it higher, lower, or at the same long-term 3.5% average, their equity should react less to the environment and investor sentiment and more to the underlying company fundamentals and their growth. But not everything else has been staying the same recently. And that brings us to the second chart. Interest rates have risen from nearly zero at the start of the pandemic to around 1% currently, and with general expectations for a 2.8% level by early next year. Now, our fixed income subcommittee is far more knowledgeable about the implications of monetary policy than I am. I just want to talk about how equity markets responded to those changes. And if you've been watching the markets recently, you've seen how U.S. equities reacted to actions or statements by the Federal Reserve. Now, just so you're aware, I'm recording this about a week before the investors meeting takes place, which means it's entirely possible that Chairman Powell or another Fed governor said something that whipped markets into a downward spiral one day and then into an upward frenzy the next trading day. For example, in the first week of May, the Fed announced a 50 basis point increase. The markets were flat at first because that was generally expected. But later that afternoon, Powell said it was unlikely for any hikes larger than 50 basis points, and there was a relief rally that boosted equities. That lasted until the next day when others thought larger hikes might still be needed to combat inflation, and the markets fell back sharply. With these fluid macroeconomic forces leading to rapid changes in investor sentiment, we've seen the market narrow its focus. You may be familiar with FANG stocks, that handful of US large cap companies that often drive most of the market's performance: Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, plus a few others. So the narrowing I'm talking about was seen globally and across economic sectors. This third chart compares the breadth of the global equity market in 2021 to what we've seen thus far in 2022. For many global investors, part of their investment skill is deciding which segments to favor and which to avoid. While last year some sectors were notably better than others, you see energy's green bar at 36% beating the rest. There were other areas of strong performance, and the overall global equity market had a 19% return in 2021. Compare that to the yellow bars for 2022, where energy again is strong with a positive 20% return through the end of last month. However, every other sector saw negative returns this year, and that's what I mean by a narrow market. Either you focused on energy and did well with your investments, or you didn't do poorly. And that has proven very difficult for diversified portfolios, such as what we have within the equity pool. However, markets tend not to remain that narrow for too long, and we have seen in the past the benefits of carefully selected active managers in a diversified pool, and we expect to see that again in the future. But don't take that to mean that during these periods of market stresses, your investment committee leaves the equity allocation on autopilot. We have expectations for which managers should contribute in what types of environments. When that repeatedly fails to happen or other issues arise, we take action. This last table is an updated version of what I showed at last year's meeting. As a reminder, we believe in long-term strategic allocations. Those targets are 60% to U.S. equities, 40% to non-U.S. equities, with the non-U.S. portion split 32-8 between developed markets and emerging markets. We review the target versus actual allocations each quarter and have a formal asset allocation discussion with the full committee and our external consultant once a year. We think about areas that work for active managers and those where we want passive index allocations. And adjustments get made as needed. So here you see the current manager lineup and what it looked like over the last several years. Ideally, we hope we can find stable, good performing managers that we can use for some time. But there are occasional organizational changes at firms that we and our consultant believe are detrimental. At other times, we lose confidence in underperforming managers' ability to perform. And sometimes new managers become available to us that opportunistically we want to add to the portfolio. You can see that 2 managers were added recently. SEG Baxter is currently being funded with the proceeds from a complete redemption of Marathon. We had reduced Marathon the pool 2 years ago when we added WCM. And after talking recently with Marathon and Baxter, we opted to close the balance of Marathon in favor of Baxter. Our concerns with Marathon related to recent personnel turnover there and sequential underperformance for their portfolio. A few years ago, we had greater concerns about DSM, so we closed that account and temporarily placed its assets in a passive ETF that had similar exposure to large cap growth. We considered several replacement options since 2020, but we did not find one that we liked and thought highly enough to hire. Finally, last October, we completed our evaluation of EchoStreet, thought very favorably of the firm, so it became our new manager in that area. Also worth noting is our recent decision to increase our exposure in the international index allocation as we restructure the non-U.S. equity portion. So in the current environment, there's one more topic that might be on some people's minds. So I want to talk about the exposure to Russia within the equity pool. At the start of the year, across all of our managers, 0.5% of our overall investments were in Russian securities from either index funds or emerging market managers. This compared with 0.3% for the benchmark. On March 31st, our exposure had dropped to 0.2%. And by then, the index providers had deleted Russian entirely just with a keystroke. So the benchmark was 0. Where active managers had exposure to Russia, they moved decisively this year. For example, one of our emerging market managers, GQG, used to have a very notable overweight to Russia. On December 31st, 15% of its portfolio was in Russian securities versus its benchmark of 3%. And remember, for context, I showed you a moment ago that GQG was less than 2% of the total equity pool. In January and early February, as tensions grew, GQG cut back. So that before Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, that weight was down 6.5%. In the days after the war began, GQG aggressively sold its remaining exposure, leaving it with less than 1% by the end of February. That balance was left because global sanctions meant the remaining positions became illiquid for foreign investors, and they're continuing to try to work those out of the portfolio. So I realize I've covered a lot of ground and may still not have fully addressed everyone's questions about what's happening in the equity markets and how we're positioned in the current environment. If you don't have a chance to ask me that anymore tonight, please let Kim or Howard know so that either I or other investment committee volunteers can respond to you. Meanwhile, we appreciate that you've entrusted the JCF with the charitable assets. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Weinstock. I chaired the Flexible Capital and Fixed Income subcommittees. As you may know, a lot of the work in the investment committee is done at the subcommittee level. My 2 subcommittees are quite active between our quarterly investment committee meetings. My 2 subcommittees spend a lot of time getting regular updates from existing managers that are already investing capital on behalf of the foundation We are always reviewing and monitoring our existing managers so we can make decisions about giving additional capital to a manager or redeeming from a manager. We get data from every manager on a monthly or quarterly basis. We speak to every manager at least once per year. We speak to managers more frequently if there are performance issues or other significant issues at the manager. While we have a patient approach, we will make the difficult decision to replace a manager when circumstances dictate doing so. My two subcommittees also speak to our consultants about potential new manager candidates, and our consultants help us identify and interview new manager candidates. The foundation has access to some of the best managers in the world, and we pay institutional fees to our manager, which is generally much lower than a retail investor would pay for the same manager if he or she could get access to the same managers that the foundations invest with. But in many cases, our managers don't take money from retail investors. And in some instances, our managers are totally close to both retail investors and institutional investors, but we were able to access the funds before they closed to new investors. One of the two subcommittees that I chair is the Flexible Capital Subcommittee. When we say flexible capital, we generally mean hedge funds. Hedge funds are generally specialized investment strategies only offered to sophisticated investors like institutions. Roughly 14% of the managed pool is invested in hedge funds. The goal of the foundation's hedge fund portfolio is to provide higher returns than fixed income instruments, but with a much lower level of risk than the stock market. Over the past few months, investors have been reminded that the stock market offers both risk and return. While the stock market is down year to date, our flexible capital portfolio has been break even year to date and should provide better returns to investors than investments in stocks, which is much needed at a time when stocks are performing very poorly. The ability to invest in flexible capital is one of the key advantages of investing in the managed pool. We're simply investing in something such as an index fund or an ETF. Prior to the retention of prime buckles roughly 9 years ago, the managed pool invested only in fund of funds. With prime buckles' help, we are now investing in hedge funds directly in addition to fund of funds. Within the hedge funds portfolio, we have about 60% allocated to a fund of funds managed by Blackstone that invests in a portfolio of hedge funds on a diversified basis. A typical fund of funds has investments in about 30 hedge funds. The attractiveness of a fund of funds to the foundation is the diversification that such a fund provides for us. While investing in individual hedge funds can be quite risky, history has shown that investing in a diversified pool of hedge funds is substantially less risky than investing in the stock market, for example. Blackstone is a best-in-class manager within the fund of funds category. What Blackstone gives the foundation is three things in addition to broad diversification. Number one, the Blackstone Fund of Funds is invested in several best-in-class managers that are closed to new investors and funds that the foundation could not access itself. Number two, the Blackstone Fund of Funds gives the benefit of fee discounts from the underlying managers that the foundation could not negotiate on its own. And the third benefit is co-investments. Blackstone can directly participate in some of the most attractive investments that their managers own, where the foundation could not get access to such co-investments. In addition to our investment in Blackstone's fund of funds, we invest roughly 40% of our flexible capital in individual hedge funds. Today, we have investments with two truly best-in-class fund managers with long histories of outperforming their peers. The subcommittee only recommends investing in individual hedge funds after significant due diligence and with the benefit of our outside consultants' input. Generally, we are limiting ourselves to large hedge funds with long and successful track records. We are not investing in smaller hedge funds, nor are we investing in hedge funds with narrow investment strategies, like focusing on a single industry or a single geographic region. We expect to continue to pursue a hybrid strategy in hedge funds where a portion is invested with the best-in-class fund of funds manager and where a portion is invested in best-in-class individual hedge funds. Today, we are invested in two best-in-class hedge funds, Davidson Kempner Institutional Partners, and Baupost Value Partners. And these are core holdings for the foundation. Davidson Kempner is a multi-strategy manager with a strong expertise in risky credit. Baupost is run by one of the world's most famous value investors, Seth Klarman, and invests in equities and other special situations, including distressed debt. These two funds and Blackstone both have significant exposures to distressed debt and other risky credit strategies. These are strategies that are very timely in the current investment environment. The other, as I mentioned before, the other subcommittee that I chair is the fixed income subcommittee, which takes the lead in selecting all managers for the fixed pool and also takes the lead in selecting managers for the fixed income segment of the managed pool, which comprises about 10% of the managed pool. The fixed pool, by definition, is intended to be somewhat boring. The number one mandate for the fixed pool is to preserve investors' capital, with only a secondary mandate of the pool to earn attractive returns. We take only limited interest rate risk and limited credit risk in the fixed pool. Over the 14-year history of the fixed pool, the worst calendar year of performance was a loss of a fraction of 1% that occurred in 2008, the worst year ever for investing in my lifetime. Unfortunately, the fixed pool seems to be on its way to its worst year ever. For the first 9 months of the fiscal year, the fixed pool has declined in value by a little over 2%. Why has that happened? I would point out two reasons. First, the yield of the portfolio at the beginning of the fiscal year was really low, with a yield of less than 1%. That is the highest return we could earn given the risk parameters of the pool. Second, the market interest rates that we use as the benchmark for this pool have roughly tripled in the past year. This is an extraordinarily rapid increase in interest rates. To point out how unusual this is, 1981 was the last time, and perhaps the only time, that interest rates tripled in such a short period of time. The combination of price decline coming from a tripling of interest rates and the lack of current income of the portfolio have proven to be a difficult mix. The good news is that the losses are very modest, and this portfolio outperformed almost any other fixed income strategy over the same period of time. And the fixed pool should return to positive returns in the not too distant future. And the odds of a similar increase in interest rates coming anytime soon is really, really small. While the yield of the portfolio has increased, interest rates are still in the lower single digits. At today's interest rates, investors in the fixed pool should expect returns from the fixed pool to be in the area of 2 to 3%, with very limited risk of loss of capital. Over 80% of the fixed pool is invested in a separately managed account managed by a high-quality investment manager. The manager is a fiduciary trust, which is part of the Franklin Templeton Group. This managed account is invested in high-quality bonds pursuant to guidelines designed to meet the specific objectives of the fixed pool. The diversified portfolio that fiduciary manages for us has a yield of close to 3% against less than 1% a year ago. The account has no bonds rated lower than single A, and the average maturity of the portfolio is only 4 years. It's relatively short for a fixed income portfolio. And so I would note that the fiduciary portfolio I would define as a medium duration portfolio, and with shorter maturities in the portfolio. It doesn't take substantial interest rate risk. Thus, the fixed pool is insulated from reporting significant negative returns during periods of rising interest rates, unlike many other fixed income alternatives that report negative returns as rates increase. But as I just discussed, the pool is not immune from losing money in a year where rates go up so significantly. The fixed pool also has a modest position in the Blackstone Fund of Funds that is intended to take a moderate amount of risk to increase the return of the fixed pool without deviating from its primary mission of preserving capital. What we have considered and rejected over time many other fixed income alternatives as too risky for the fixed pool, such as high yield bonds. Over the past 2 years, we reduced and exited investment bank loans to make a more conservative posture for the fixed pool. I would note the fixed pool has performed much better than high yield bonds, for example, over the past year. In addition to other investments noted in the fixed pool, we currently have 5% of the fixed pool invested in Israeli bonds. We feel that such an investment is consistent both with the JCF's mission and with their fiduciary duties, as these investments yield competitive returns for the fixed pool as measured on a risk-reward basis. In the managed pool, about 10% of the managed pool is invested in fixed income securities, of which a majority is invested in a fiduciary trust portfolio that is managed in a similar manner to what I described before for the account they manage for the fixed pool. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Good evening. My name is David Pulver, and I chair the private capital portion of the Jewish Community Foundation managed investment pool. I will discuss private capital this evening and basically going to discuss three questions that you probably have. The role of private capital in the total portfolio. Second one is how we think about investing your money in private capital. And third, how has private capital performed? Private capital plays a couple of roles in the total portfolio. One, it helps diversify the portfolio. It has a 19% allocation to buyouts and a 7% allocation to real estate. It also provides an opportunity to achieve higher returns. The price you pay for higher returns in private capital is illiquidity. When we make a commitment to a private equity fund, the expected start to finish time period can be anywhere between 8 and 15 years. The fund draws down our money over a 3 or 4 year period as they are making investments, and then they operate the companies, or in the case of real estate, the real estate assets, over a 3 to 6 year period, and then they sell the companies or the real estate assets. How do we think about investing your money in private capital? Up on the screen, you're going to see a little chart. It's called a private equity distribution chart. And this is a very important chart, and I want to go through it slowly. I want to make sure each person can understand this chart. So as we start, if you look along the bottom, you see various asset classes: core bond, domestic large equity, U.S., non-U.S. developed equity, venture capital buyout, so forth. If you look along the left side, there's a vertical line, and to the left of that vertical line, you have percentages. It goes from the bottom of -5% to the top of 35%, plus 35%. Now, if you take a look above each asset class, there's a vertical line. On the top of the vertical line is a green bar, and that bar is the percentage that the top quartile fund would earn. On the bottom of each line, vertical line, is a blue bar, and that's the percentage that a bottom quartile firm would earn. Somewhere in between the green and the blue line, you see a yellow bar, and that yellow bar is the median return. So as you look at this chart, if you look at buyout, let's take a look at buyout, which is one of the areas that we play in. You can see that the median return is 15%. If you go to that yellow line and you just kind of look over to the very left, you'll see that it lines up with about 15%. If you compare it with, say, the second asset class, second from the left, domestic large cap equity, you can see that that return is about 9%. So again, you're able to earn on average for the median return 6% higher, but you pay for that by the illiquidity, as I mentioned above. So the other thing you should look at, and which is very, very important, if you take a look at the buyout and you take a look at the difference between the green bar and the blue bar, which is the difference between the top quartile and the bottom quartile, it's about 18%. If you look at this, go back to domestic large cap equity and look at the difference between the green bar and the blue bar, it's 2%. So obviously, if you can get into the good top funds, you will benefit because you have an opportunity to earn a whole lot more than the median return in an asset class like buyout, or to the next. We also play in growth equity, which is next to it. It's even a higher green bar. So the critical thing is that in these asset classes, you have really this opportunity to earn additional return versus the more marketable securities. But you have illiquidity. And that's why we only have about 26% of our portfolio in this, because we have to make sure that we accommodate that illiquidity that's the nature of this asset class. Now the next question is, well, okay, how do we perform? You'll see the next chart coming up. And what this shows is, on the private equity side, you can see 1, 3, 5, and 7-year returns. We don't quite have 10-year returns yet because we've been following this for almost 10 years. I think we're a year or so away from 10-year returns. But you can see that in the 1 year, if you look at the private equity, which includes natural resources but does not include real estate, and I'll talk about natural resources in a minute. We've had an incredible, year, a 1 year return of, close to 47%. 3-year returns, 21, 5-year returns, 16, and 7-year returns. Those are very good returns. And then if you look at private real estate, similar returns. Now, to be fair on this whole thing, what you have to do is you really have to focus on 5 and 7-year returns, and then hopefully 10-year returns, which we will have in the next year or so. Maybe next year we'll have the 10-year returns. We're getting close, as I said, because the early returns can really be impacted by a variety of things that don't make them really significant returns. They're not really telling you what's happening. It's good to have those returns, built in, but you look at 5, and this is a long-term asset class, and you've got to look at 5 and 7-year returns. Couple things to point out, and that is, I mentioned to you that natural resources is included in private equity, and I do that because we used to have a separate asset allocation of 4% to private natural resources. And in 2016, we discontinued that. We did not like natural resources. It's not that we won't invest in natural resources, but we want them to compete with all the other options we have in private equity, and not have their own allocation. Now, to give you an example of how the difference, if we took natural resources out, the 46 that you see in year 1 for private equity would have been 53, and the 21 in year 3 would have been 24. In year 5, the 16 or 15.8 would have been 23. And in year 7, the 16 would have been 21. So it has a major negative impact on the returns. Actually, it's in the last year or so, it's done pretty well. But overall, in this long-term asset, it has not been a great asset class. So this gives you a sense of what we're doing, how we're trying to strategize in order to maximize returns. And it also shows we really, one of the things we've done over a several year period, I mean, it's close to a decade, is really fight our way into these top funds, which don't need us. We're a small investor. And it is, there's a lot of people that want to get into the top funds. And so it's really a whole cultivation process in order to convince these people to take our money. Anyway, that gives you a sense of private equity. And I want to thank you for listening. And if anybody has any questions or anything, you can always reach out to me and I'll be happy to answer whatever you have. Good night.
Hi, my name is Kim Hirsch.
Good
I'm
evening.
Executive
I'm
Director
Jeff Braemer.
of the JCF, and I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. I wanted to particularly thank Steve Levy, our amazing JCF president, Peter Langerman, our investment chair, of course, the subcommittee chairs, and particularly thanks just for this evening to Howard Rabner and Michal Werner for putting on this wonderful program, and thank you to our panelists. And just mostly thank you to our fund holders. Thank you for putting your trust in us at the JCF. We're here to work with you. If you have any questions from this evening, please be in touch with me or with Howard Rabner or one of our leaders. Thank you so much for coming.